The 911 dispatcher's voice trembled as she replayed the call for the third time. A woman's voice whispered frantically, "They're here." "I can't hide anymore," before the line went dead. What chilled her most was that the call was traced to Precinct 13, a police station abandoned after a fire nearly 30 years ago. When two officers are dispatched to investigate, they unknowingly walk into a trap set by something far beyond human comprehension. Before we uncover the horrors awaiting these officers, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling tales like this one. Hit the bell icon so you never miss the next nightmare. Officer James Carter sighed heavily as he flipped through his notes in the patrol car. He was a seasoned cop, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and skepticism of anything that couldn't be explained by logic. Beside him sat rookie Sarah Mitchell, nervously clutching her flashlight. Sarah was new to the force, eager to prove herself, but visibly uneasy about their assignment. Why would anyone call 911 from a building that's been abandoned for decades? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Carter shrugged, his gaze fixed on the dimly lit road ahead. Probably a prank. Or maybe some squatters messing around. His tone was calm, but Sarah noticed his grip on the steering wheel tighten. As they approached the precinct, the air grew colder, almost unnaturally so. The building loomed in the darkness like a skeletal husk, its once proud facade now blackened and crumbling from the long-ago fire. The windows were shattered, and the surrounding area was eerily quiet, as though even nature avoided this place. "Looks welcoming," Sarah muttered, her attempt at humor falling flat. Carter killed the engine and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Let's make this quick," he said, motioning for Sarah to follow. The front doors creaked loudly as Carter pushed them open, revealing a corridor cloaked in darkness. The faint smell of burnt wood and dampness hung in the air, making Sarah wrinkle her nose. Their flashlights flickered slightly as they stepped inside, their beams cutting through the dense gloom. The precinct was a snapshot of chaos frozen in time. Desks were overturned, charred file cabinets lay scattered, and faded graffiti covered the walls. The ceiling was partially collapsed in places, exposing beams and wires that hung like skeletal remains. "Creepy doesn't even begin to cover it," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps echoing down the hallway. As they moved deeper into the building, they reached the dispatch room. A single phone sat on the desk, untouched by time or decay. It looked out of place, almost pristine compared to the surrounding debris. The receiver was off the hook, and a faint crackling sound came from the line. "Looks like our caller," Carter said, stepping closer. He picked up the receiver and held it to his ear. His expression shifted immediately, his usually composed face now pale and tense. "What is it?" Sarah asked, alarmed. Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly lowered the receiver, his eyes fixed on it, as though it might come alive. "A voice," he finally said, his tone quieter than usual. It said, "Why have you come?" Before Sarah could respond, the phone slammed itself back onto the cradle with a loud clatter, making both officers jump. The fluorescent lights above flickered violently, and for a brief moment, Carter thought he saw a shadow dart across the hallway outside the dispatch room. He whipped his flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. "Probably just a rat," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Sarah, however, wasn't so sure. She felt an inexplicable pressure in the air, as though they were being watched. "Let's check the main offices and get out of here," she suggested, her voice tight with unease. They ventured further into the precinct, their flashlights illuminating dusty filing cabinets and faded case files strewn across the floor. Sarah noticed one file that seemed oddly clean compared to the others. She picked it up and opened it, revealing a photograph of a man with a haunting expression. "What's this?" she asked, showing the file to Carter. His brow furrowed as he scanned the contents. "Looks like a missing persons case," he said. "From 30 years ago, around the time this place shut down." As they examined the file, A faint noise broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from down the hallway. Both officers froze, their eyes locking for a brief moment before Carter motioned for Sarah to follow. The tapping grew louder as they approached the source, which appeared to be an old interrogation room. The door was slightly ajar, and a dim light flickered inside. Carter pushed the door open with his flashlight, revealing an empty room with a single chair in the center. The tapping had stopped, but the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Suddenly, Sarah's radio crackled to life. A distorted voice, low and menacing, spoke through the static. "You shouldn't be here." Her blood ran cold, and she instinctively looked at Carter, whose face was a mixture of confusion and fear. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. Before he could answer, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and coming closer. "Stay close," Carter said, gripping his flashlight like a weapon as they turned to face whatever was coming for them. The footsteps grew louder, their heavy thuds reverberating through the abandoned precinct. Carter and Sarah stood frozen for a moment, their flashlights trembling in their hands as the sound echoed closer. Then, as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing against their ears like a physical force. "Did you see anything?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Carter shook his head, his jaw tight. "No, but something's not right here." They moved cautiously, their flashlights scanning every corner of the corridor. The shadows seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally, creating fleeting shapes that danced along the walls. As they approached the end of the hallway, they found a staircase leading down to the basement. The air grew colder, and Sarah could see her breath fogging in the dim light. "Basement?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking slightly. Carter hesitated. "We have to check it out. If someone's down there, we need to know." Reluctantly, Sarah followed him down the creaking stairs. The smell of dampness and decay grew stronger with each step. At the bottom of the staircase, they found a heavy metal door slightly ajar. Beyond it, the basement stretched out into darkness. As they entered, their flashlights revealed rows of rusted filing cabinets and scattered papers that had been left to rot. The walls were lined with old evidence boxes, some of which had been broken open, their contents spilling onto the floor. Sarah's light fell on a strange marking on the wall, a crude symbol etched into the concrete, surrounded by what looked like dried blood. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter examined the symbol, his face grim. "I've never seen anything like it. Looks ritualistic." "Carter, these are the guys from the pictures on the wall upstairs," she said, holding up the folder. "But these files, they say they all went missing." Carter scanned the documents, his face darkening as he read the contents. The files detailed allegations of corruption, abuse of power, and even murder. It appeared that several officers had been complicit in covering up crimes committed by the precinct's leadership. "This place was rotten to the core," Carter muttered. "But what happened to them?" As they pieced together the story, the atmosphere around them grew heavier. The faint sound of whispers began to fill the air, rising and falling like a sinister chant. Sarah turned her flashlight toward the source and froze. At the far end of the basement stood a figure, its face obscured by shadows. It was motionless, yet the whispers seemed to emanate from it. "Who's there?" Carter called out, his voice firm but laced with tension. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, its steps slow and deliberate. As it came closer, the light from their flashlights revealed its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where its face should have been was a swirling void, dark and endless. "Run!" Carter shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the staircase. As they sprinted up the steps, the whispers grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps chasing them. Reaching the top, they slammed the metal door shut and braced it with a nearby desk. "What was that?" Sarah gasped, her heart pounding. "I don't know," Carter said, his face pale. "But we're not alone here." They regrouped in the dispatch room, trying to make sense of what they had just seen. Sarah's hand shook as she pulled out her phone to call for backup, but there was no signal. The radio on her belt crackled again, this time with a different voice. "Help me," it said, weak and desperate. "Who is this?" Sarah asked, panic creeping into her voice. The response was chilling. "I'm still here, trapped. They won't let me leave." Before they could react, the lights flickered again, plunging the precinct into darkness. When their flashlights came back on, the symbol Sarah had seen in the basement was now scrawled across the walls of the dispatch room, glowing faintly. Carter looked at Sarah, his expression grim. "Whatever this is, it's not just some prank. This place, it's alive." The sound of distant laughter echoed through the halls, low and guttural. It wasn't human. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Carter took a deep breath, steeling himself. "We finish what we started. We find out what happened here." The door to the dispatch room creaked open slowly, revealing the dark hallway beyond. With no other choice, they stepped back into the shadows, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The hallway stretched before them, darker and more twisted than it had been moments ago. The walls seemed to shift and close in, as if the building itself were alive. Carter and Sarah moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive gloom. The air was thick and cold, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "We need to find out what's going on," Carter said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Sarah nodded but stayed silent. Her hands trembled as she held her flashlight, the memory of the faceless figure etched into her mind. As they turned a corner, they stumbled upon a room they hadn't seen before. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint, flickering light seeped through the crack. Carter pushed it open cautiously, revealing what appeared to be an evidence room. The room was lined with shelves filled with files, photos, and old case notes. In the center of the room stood a large table covered in papers and strange artifacts. Sarah picked up a yellowed photograph from the table and gasped. It was a picture of the officers whose files they had found in the basement, standing together in front of the precinct. But their faces in the photograph were distorted, twisted into grotesque expressions of pain and terror. "Carter, look at this," Sarah said, holding up the photo. Carter frowned as he examined it. What the hell happened here? Before Sarah could respond, a loud bang echoed from the corner of the room. They spun around, their flashlights landing on a shelf that had toppled over, scattering files across the floor. Among the debris was an old journal, its leather cover worn and cracked. Carter picked it up and flipped through the pages. The entries were written in a shaky hand, detailing the final days of the precinct. The officers had been investigating a series of disappearances when they stumbled upon something they shouldn't have, a ritualistic circle hidden in the basement. The journal described how the officers had tried to cover it up, but one by one, they began to disappear. The final entry was chilling. "It's not a case. It's a curse. We brought it upon ourselves. We will never leave." As Carter finished reading, the whispers in the room grew louder, rising to a deafening cacophony. The shelves rattled, and the walls seemed to pulse with life. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The light flickered violently before plunging them into darkness. "Carter," Sarah shouted, panic overtaking her. "I'm here," Carter replied, fumbling with his flashlight. When the light came back on, they weren't in the evidence room anymore. They were standing in a pristine version of the precinct, as it must have looked decades ago. The walls were clean, the desks organized, and the air was filled with the sound of typewriters and ringing phones. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, looking around in disbelief. The precinct was bustling with activity, but something was off. The officers moved mechanically, their faces blank and expressionless. They didn't seem to notice Carter and Sarah, who stood frozen in the middle of the room. "Are we in the past?" Sarah asked. Before Carter could answer, a loud, anguished scream pierced the air. They turned toward the sound and saw a group of officers gathered in a circle in the center of the room. This scene was horrifying. The officers were performing a ritual, chanting in a language neither Carter nor Sarah could understand. In the center of the circle was a man bound to a chair, his face contorted in fear. The chanting grew louder as the officers raised their hands, and the room was engulfed in a blinding light. When the light faded, the man was gone, leaving only an empty chair and a pool of blood. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Carter didn't answer. He was staring at the circle on the floor, which began to glow faintly. The walls around them darkened, and the bustling precinct dissolved into shadows. The officers in the ritual turned toward them, their blank faces now twisted into grotesque masks of anger and pain. They began to advance, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Run," Carter shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. They sprinted down the hallway, but the building seemed to shift and change around them, turning into a labyrinth of endless corridors. Doors appeared and disappeared, and the whispers followed them like a sinister chant. As they rounded a corner, they found themselves back in the basement, the glowing circle from the ritual now etched into the floor. The faceless figure from before stood in the center, its void-like face staring directly at them. "It's the curse," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "It's trying to trap us here." The figure raised a hand, and the walls around them began to close in. The shadows grew thicker, and the air became almost impossible to breathe. Carter looked at Sarah, determination in his eyes. "We have to fight this. We have to end it." "How?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. Before Carter could answer, the figure lunged toward them, its form dissolving into a swarm of shadows that engulfed them completely. Carter and Sarah were plunged into suffocating darkness, the shadows pressing against their skin like a living force. The whispers were now deafening, a chaotic symphony of anguish and rage. Carter's flashlight flickered weakly, barely illuminating their terrified faces. "Carter, I can't breathe," Sarah cried, clawing at the air as though it might give her some relief. "Hold on," Carter yelled back, forcing himself to focus. He fumbled for the journal he had taken from the evidence room, flipping through its pages in desperation. The journal's final entry echoed in his mind. "It's not a case. It's a curse. We brought it upon ourselves. We will never leave." The words sent a shiver down his spine, but there was something else, a sketch of the glowing circle, surrounded by markings he hadn't noticed before. "These symbols, they're a way to break it," Carter muttered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony around them. Sarah clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What are you talking about?" "The curse. It's tied to that ritual," Carter explained, pointing at the glowing circle on the floor. "We have to destroy it." The shadows swirled violently, as if reacting to his words. The faceless figure reappeared, its void-like face staring directly at them. Its form seemed to flicker, shifting between solid and ethereal. "We don't have much time," Carter said, his voice firm. "Distract it while I figure this out." Sarah hesitated, fear gripping her, but she nodded. She picked up a piece of debris from the ground and threw it at the figure. "Hey, over here," she shouted, her voice trembling but defiant. The figure turned its attention to her, its form stretching and distorting as it advanced. Sarah backed away, her flashlight beam shaking as she pointed it at the entity. Meanwhile, Carter studied the markings around the circle, matching them to the sketches in the journal. He grabbed a piece of broken pipe and began scratching through the glowing symbols on the floor, disrupting their patterns. The room shook violently, and an inhuman screech filled the air. The shadows writhed in agony, recoiling from the disrupted symbols. The faceless figure let out a guttural roar, its form flickering more erratically. "Carter, it's coming for you," Sarah screamed as the figure turned and lunged toward him. With no time to think, Carter swung the pipe at the figure. It passed through the entity, but the impact seemed to weaken it momentarily. "Keep going," Sarah yelled, grabbing a nearby chair and hurling it at the figure. Carter worked furiously, scratching through the last of the symbols. As he disrupted the final marking, the circle's glow intensified, and a blinding light filled the room. The shadows let out a final, piercing wail before evaporating into nothingness. The figure stood frozen, its form crumbling like ash caught in the wind. It let out one last, haunting whisper, "You can't escape, the curse never ends," before dissolving completely. The light faded, and the room fell silent. Carter and Sarah were left standing in the dimly lit basement, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter nodded, though his expression was grim. For now. They made their way back upstairs, the precinct eerily quiet. As they stepped outside into the cold night air, the oppressive weight that had surrounded the building seemed to lift. "Let's call it in," Carter said, pulling out his radio. But as they looked back at the precinct, they noticed something chilling. The building's windows, dark and empty, reflected their own images, but behind them, faint shadows lingered, watching silently. Sarah shivered, her eyes fixed on the building. "Do you think it's really over?" Carter didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, leading her back to the car. As they drove away, neither of them noticed the faint glow that began to emanate from the precinct's basement windows, nor the whispers that had started once again. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Hit the bell icon to ensure you never miss the next nightmare.